The next bullet is that we have existence for. Existence for as opposed to existence with. Right? Existence for as opposed to existence with. Very simple. Existence for, I recognize that my existence is framed in terms of an object. I am no different than an object for the oppressor. The oppressor collects objects, right? The oppressor collects objects, and the oppressor, in effect, collects minds, right? Collects minds so that you have a bunch of puppets saying exactly the same stuff, right? Yeah, my interpretation of this particular theorist is exactly the same as my professor's interpretation of this particular theorist. Why? Because that's how it was taught, and that's the only mode of interpretation, right? It is an attempt to reinforce the canon through an indoctrination, a process of indoctrination, right? So that this experience for, this existence rather for, is I become the possession, literally, the possession of another, as opposed to existence with, right? On an existence with model, right, in a problem-posing model, I've recognized that there's an exchange, right? This exchange between myself and the other on myself, is a necessary consequence of our embodiment, to be technical. And what we do is we exchange the idea which is shared, right? Our embodiment might be different, but the content of our consciousness can be shared. Okay, banking concept, objectification of self. Objectification of self. In the problem-posing model, we have humanization. We recognize from previous discussions in Chapter 2 that the objectification of self is synonymous with dehumanization, right? You cannot have an objectification of a human being without dehumanizing that human being, right? We need to mechanize that which is organic, right? And in order to mechanize that which is organic, part of the individual has to conform to some governing principle or governing ideology or governing model, right? So, for example, if you're going to objectify yourself and you're a basketball player, then you better be able to jump really high. If you're going to objectify yourself and you're a female pop star, then you better look really, really sexy, right? So you get the idea. There is a governing standard which prescribes conformity, and insofar as we adapt, either willfully or unwillfully, to that prescription, we are oppressed by that prescription. Banking concept is non-critical, and obviously the problem-posing model is critical. Right, so the banking concept is non-critical. The problem-posing model is critical. Pretty simple, right? When an individual prescribes behavior for me, when an individual prescribes behavior for me, if they say K and I think K, well, there's nothing critical in that. I haven't created anything. Someone told me that, 2 plus 2 is 5. I didn't think critically about it, and I parrot 2 plus 2 equals 5 without thinking critically. Bad example, but you get the idea. Critical reflection is different, right? Because information is given, but that information is transformed. And it's in precisely this mode right here, in the transformation of that original knowledge, that we have critical reflection. Right? So it's at this point, before it's given back, that we have critical reflection, right? And then obviously I get this information, K prime. I might think on K prime, and now I might disseminate K 2 primes, right? And so on and so on and so forth. So this goes on forever, right? It's a process of creation, not a process of transmission. The process of transmission is the banking concept. The process of creation is the problem-posing model. In the banking concept, we have a dichotomization. and there's a separation between self on the one hand, and then the world as something separate. Right? So in the banking concept, we have a separation between, we have a dichotomization, right? Dichotomization between self and the world. There is this thing, self, and there is this other thing, world. So if you were to ask banking concept theorists, quote unquote, so remember in the previous example when we talked about existence of humans within the world, imagine that the world, that humans were to disappear. Would there still be a world? They would say, oh yeah, for sure there would still be a world. Why would there be a world? Because they see it as separate from human beings, right? So its existence isn't necessitated by humans at all. Not necessarily a bad account, right? I mean, there are some, you know, and I don't want to get outside of Freire, but there might be some significance to that interpretation on a scientific model. On an epistemological model, which is sort of what's governing Freire's account at this point, there's absolutely no way to know of the existence of the world independent to my own existence. I can only infer that there will be people after me because I'm not the last person on the planet, right? After the last person on the planet dies, I mean, we can't even talk about the planet, much less an I. So a little bit more tricky, but still a problem for the banking concept. What Freire does to counter this in the problem-posing model is he views the world as self and the self as world. Right? So there's world and self are interchangeable. Right? So that there's this relationship between the world and self. And what we saw in Husserl's, in Freire's interpretation of Husserl's turning toward was the idea that me as an individual, I'm always turning toward my place in the world, right? My place within the world. What is my place within the world as, and I go through all my sort of demographic identifiers, but as this type of individual. And I recognize what's in the background, not the foreground, right? And it is the attempt to turn my attention toward what is hidden, right? The lacuna, the gap, the missing parts that is going to inform the meaning of my life, right? This is done continually in an exchange with other people who should be doing exactly the same thing. So, in theory at least, if we are all engaged, and you know, a state of affairs like this would be heaven. I mean, it would be peace on earth. I don't know if we'll ever see this state of affairs where everyone is critically reflecting on the contributions that they can make, right? And all too often what ends up happening is, I know what I need to do, and I'm telling you what you need to do. And it's this sort of imposition, this judgment, this finger pointing that creates, you know, and serves as conceptually the foundational account of sort of conflict, right? Conflict arises out of all judgments, right? Because there's going to be discrepancies, you know, socially relative discrepancies, theologically relative discrepancies as to the justification for these judgments, right? So, self and world versus this dichotomization.